recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Ranking Member Lucas, I appreciate the opportunity to ask questions. I really appreciate the opportunity to have comments from such a distinguished group of witnesses. That's very helpful and insightful for our committee and the work that we're trying to do. I only have a certain amount of time, so Dr. Allison, you're the one that I'm going to ask a couple of questions of. First off, though, I just wonder if you're aware that if you'd have just gone two more hours north when you came to Indiana from Alabama, you'd have been at Purdue University. So that, just trying to help you. You know, in your testimony and all the work that you've done, what, over 600 scientific publications, you've edited 5 books. You serve as a member of the Committee on Reproducibility and Replicability from the National Academy of Sciences. So I think it's very appropriate to have you here to talk about the things that we're interested in today. And so my first question is that in your testimony you mentioned that perhaps a thorough statement of broad principles like what constitutes good scientific evidence and how to effectively weigh and evaluate evidence for drawing conclusions could be more useful than a single rulemaking transparency. Could you elaborate on that?
Certainly. Let me say that these are my own opinions and not necessarily those of the committee that I was here to represent today, since the committee didn't address the EPA rule per se. But it seems to me that EPA, to construct a simplistic rule that says information will be available or usable only if it's reproducible and transparent, puts too much weight on one factor. It may allow things in that shouldn't come in, and it may exclude things that shouldn't be excluded. Whereas there are other factors that need to be involved. It becomes reasonable only to the extent that exceptions are allowed. But those exceptions will likely be extensive and frequently necessary. Questions have already been raised about exactly how would those exceptions be made, and would the process of making those exceptions foster trust or distrust or optimal approaches. Better yet, it seems to me, would be to say multiple factors are important to weigh, including but not limited to reproducibility and transparency, replicability, generalizability of findings, and importantly, overall research rigor. This can be assessed on a case-by-case basis so that the overall evidence can be weighed, all evidence can be considered, but then ultimately decisions are based upon the weight of the evidence. This is the typical practice in much of science, as I wrote extensively in my written remarks about this, and is a practice generally used by other organizations, for example, like FDA.
I found it especially interesting. You mentioned that scientific research, you know, involves data and methods and then logic and how you got there. But the application of rigor in the methods, I found that extremely useful and extremely relevant to making sound scientific decisions. So any further thoughts on that issue on rigor?
Certainly. We know that a great deal of science varies tremendously in the degree of rigor. Some studies have stronger value than others in helping us determine the truth of propositions. We can only evaluate that strength of those studies to the extent that we really know what was done. So knowing what was done is very important, and that's partly where transparency comes in. So transparency is vital. We do want to promote it in all of science. As Dr. Nozick said, we are, as the entire scientific community, working on this, taking ever more greater steps to make more and more science transparent. But as Dr. Rice and others have pointed out, there will always be certain aspects of science that are not fully transparent for any number of reasons. These can include protection of patient privacy, fulfillment of the contract of informed consent, simple loss of information, and we should not make a dicto simpliciter out of the notion that we will only consider information that's transparent.
Thank you. I've got a whole notebook here where I could spend the rest of the day with you, but they tell me I've got 5 minutes. So thank all of you for being here, and I yield back.